For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is Unveiling Jesus Christ.
Hello and welcome to Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet. My last several podcasts have touched upon the concept of the Great Apostasy. John defined the timing of the Great Apostasy in Revelation 13:5 as a period of 42 months, which equates to 1,260 days of prophetic years, which means 1,260 years between 570 and 1830 AD. In Revelation 13:6, we learned about Satan's power during the Great Apostasy. He was given a mouth to speak 3 different types of blasphemy during the period of the Great Apostasy. Today, we will find out in Revelation 13:7 the effect of these blasphemies against the saints of God on a worldwide scale. For the nutshell version of this podcast, you can check out section 223 in my book that you can find on my website at unveilingjesuschrist.com. Revelation 13:7 states, "It was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and power was given unto him over all kindreds and tongues and nations." Close quote. Let's put this information in context with reference to what we have already studied in Revelation chapter 12 and 13. Remember that in chapter 12, John did a flashback to the premortal existence so that we could learn, among other things, about Satan's premortal war in heaven against the saints of the premortal church, as I discussed in my podcast about Revelation 12:7 on November 11 of 2025. We also learned that after Christ was crucified and he finished the atonement, Satan was filled with wrath and made war against the saints in Christ's ancient church, as I recorded in Revelation 12:13 and discussed in my podcast on December 16 of 2025. Satan initially had limited success in his war against the ancient church during the apostolic era because the church was nourished in the wilderness of the Roman Empire for 35 years, as I discussed in my podcast from December 21 of 2025. Satan's tide of war against the ancient church changed, however, no later than the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD, which John symbolically described in Revelation 12:15-16 as a serpent that cast out a flood of evil from its mouth, as I explained in my podcast from December 23 of 2025. Titus destroyed Jerusalem and the temple at Jerusalem in the Roman abomination of desolation in 70 AD. However, this atrocity did not destroy the infant church of Jesus Christ because the saints were warned to flee across the Jordan River to Pella before the Roman destruction. I might also add that many Christians were located outside Judea, so they didn't get the brunt of the devastation that occurred in the abomination of desolation when Jerusalem was destroyed. However, at that time, Satan, or the dragon, was given great power to make war on the remnant of saints in Christ's ancient church in Revelation 12:17, which I discussed in my podcast from December 28 of 2025. Satan made his war on the remnant of saints from Christ's ancient church through the instrumentality of the Roman Empire, represented by the image of the first beast that rose from the sea in 70 AD, as recorded in Revelation 13:1, which I discussed in my podcast on January 6 of 2026. Satan's brutal and unrelenting war on the saints continued worldwide in places like the Western Hemisphere, where Satan overcame the Nephites and caused their utter destruction, as I discussed in my podcast from January 18 of 2026. The bottom line is this. In Revelation 13:7, John describes the complete loss of Christ's true doctrines and his church in every location throughout the world, as described by LeGrand Richards, saying, I like to refer to the experience of John the Revelator when he was banished upon the Isle of Patmos. A voice from heaven said, Come up hither, and I will show thee things which must be hereafter. And the angel showed John the power that would be given to the evil one, the devil, to make war with the saints, and the saints were the followers of Jesus, and to overcome them, and to reign over all kindreds, tongues, and nations. That is one of the positive declarations in the Holy Scriptures of a complete apostasy from the church that Jesus established. Close quote. That brief history brings us to Revelation 13:7, which states that power was given to Satan to make war with the saints and to overcome them. Actually, verse 7 states that power was given to him to make war on the saints, but we concluded in prior podcasts that the him had to be Satan because of the worldwide scope of the war that John is about to describe in this verse. In other words, the complete and utter defeat of the saints was not limited to the ancient Church of Jesus Christ within the geographical boundaries of the Roman Empire, which was the domain of the first beast that rose from the sea about 70 A.D. in Revelation 13:1. On the other side of the world, the Book of Mormon describes the power given Satan on the Western Hemisphere to overcome the saints that we call the Nephites no later than about 420 A.D. As a preliminary matter, the first thing that we can say about Satan's worldwide power is this: Satan can't do anything without permission from God, as we're told by LeGrand Richards, who said, in our consideration of the apostasy, we referred to what the Lord showed to John while he was on the Isle of Patmos. We saw that power would be given to Satan to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. Close quote. Thus we see that the power given to Satan to make war with the saints was something that God allowed. We see the outward manifestation of that power in the Roman Empire, represented by the first beast, as described by Joseph Benson in 1857, saying, The power of this new Roman government became so great by divine permission that it prevailed against the worshippers of God, either to force them to a compliance with the corruptions established by its authority, or to persecute them for their constancy. Close quote. J. Perry described this power given to Satan, who acted through the Roman Empire, and the reasons why this extraordinary allowance of power was given, saying, It appears that the Lord is the one who is allowing the beast to make war with the saints, even knowing that they will be conquered for a time. It is part of the Lord's eternal plan to allow the exercise of agency to both wicked and righteous on the earth, even if the wicked martyr the righteous in the process. The Lord takes the long or eternal view, knowing that in the end, he will be able to exact full justice both from those who deserve punishment and for those who deserve comfort and reward. Close quote. As a further preliminary matter, the second thing we can say about Satan's power in Revelation 13:7 is this: Satan's power to overcome the saints is not isolated to a single point in history. John already told us in verse 5 that Satan had a mouth given him for 1260 years, so the power we're talking about covers a very long period of time, including religious wars like the Crusades during the Dark Ages, as described by Bruce R. McConkie, who said, Religious wars and persecutions are of the devil. There is no such thing as a holy war or a heaven-approved crusade. Men cannot be saved by force, Lucifer to the contrary notwithstanding. During the Christian era, hundreds and thousands have been burned and hanged as heretics, while millions have been slain in wars fomented, instigated, commanded, and led by religious leaders. We shall make no attempt to recount these deeds of brutality and butchery. Libraries are filled with histories that preserve the ugly and revolting details. Close quote. The saints of God were overcome at different times in different localities, as I described briefly in my podcast on January 20th, 2026. By way of quick recap, Satan, through the instrumentality of the first beast, spiritually overcame the saints from Christ's ancient church among the Jews during the 2nd century A.D. The demise of Christ's church came through apostasy from within the ancient church itself, as we're told by Orson Pratt, who said, "Did this authority, these gifts and blessings exist toward the close of the 2nd century of the Christian era? No. What had become of them? The people had entirely apostatized from that ancient order of things." Close quote. I place Satan's total defeat of the ancient church among the Jews in the 2nd century A.D. primarily because John wrote letters to each of the 7 churches in Asia Minor in 96 A.D. These letters can be found in Revelation chapters 2 and 3, and you can go back and check out my podcast between the dates of January 28 of 2024 and April 20th of 2024. In these chapters, we learn that the 7 remaining churches were either in a state of apostasy already, were on the brink of apostasy, or were under attack by the power of Satan acting through the first beast of the Roman Empire. On the American continent, by contrast, Satan spiritually overcame the Nephites during their apostasy that began in approximately 200 A.D., as recorded in 4th Nephi chapter 1, verses 24 to 26, where we're told that in this 201st year there began to be among them those who were lifted up in pride, such as the wearing of costly apparel and all manner of fine pearls and of the fine things of the world. And from that time forth they did have their goods and their substance no more common among them. And they began to be divided into classes, and they began to build up churches unto themselves to get gain, and began to deny the true church of Christ. Close quote. Satan overcame the saints completely when they were physically destroyed during the final genocidal battle at Cumorah in 385 A.D., as described by Monty Nyman, saying, "By the time of the final battles at Cumorah in A.D. 385, the Nephites had become so wicked that they were destroyed as a nation. Mormon lamented, 'O ye fair ones, how could ye have departed from the ways of the Lord? O ye fair ones, how could ye have rejected that Jesus, who stood with open arms to receive you? Behold, if ye had not done this, ye would not have fallen.'" Close quote. The prophet Moroni was the last legal administrator of the priesthood in America, and he died sometime after 420 A.D. Satan finally overcame the last of all saints on a worldwide basis in 570 A.D., when the lost 10 tribes were translated, as I have previously described in several podcasts, including most notably my podcast on May 27th of 2025. Once the lost 10 tribes were translated, there were no legal administrators of the priesthood left anywhere on the earth, which means, by the definition, the apostasy had become worldwide, as stated by Orson Pratt, saying, "Since the Great Apostasy, sincerity has characterized millions of professed Christians, but none of them have obeyed the ancient gospel because no one was authorized to legally administer its ordinances to them. Therefore, notwithstanding their sincerity, they could not obey the gospel for the want of a legal administrator. Hence, they could have no legal claim on the gospel blessings, and for this reason, they could not become legal or adopted believers." Close quote. Matthias Cowley expressed a similar view after quoting portions of Revelation 13, verses 4 to 7, saying, "This declaration of the Scriptures is very broad, indicating clearly that the saints should be overcome, and the power of the beast should be so extensive as to cover all kindred, tongues, and nations, thus leaving the people destitute of divine authority and bereft of the glorious plan of redemption." Close quote. Donald W. Perry also described the gradual spread of apostasy among the various groups of Christ's threefold sheepfold, saying, "After the crucifixion of Christ, the earth suffered a falling away from the truth, called the Great Apostasy. This apostasy began within decades of Christ's ascension into heaven and continued until all true believers of that dispensation had either died or were martyred. The same scene eventually played out in every locality that had the gospel, such as among the Nephites and Lamanites. 4 righteous men we know of from ancient times were not killed: John the Revelator and 3 Nephite disciples, all of whom were translated. But, as translated beings, they apparently were no longer considered fully part of the mortal earth." Close quote. Notice that Brother Perry does not specifically say that the lost 10 tribes were translated. He does recognize, however, that translated people, like the lost 10 tribes, are not considered part of the mortal earth when it comes to earthly priesthood authority and the administration of that authority on earth. Therefore, when they were translated and took their priesthood with them to heaven, it can be then said that Satan entirely overcame the saints in every locality of the church on a worldwide basis. Orrin Hatch made this astute observation about priesthood power during the Great Apostasy, saying, "The pervasive influence of Satan during the Dark Ages is confirmed in John's prophecy in Revelation 13:7, which he quotes. This verse says that the saints would be overcome by Satan. I submit that if the power of the priesthood, God's power, was on the earth at the time, the church would have been spared and the saints would not have been overcome. Put another way, if only one holder of God's priesthood had been on the earth, since God's power or priesthood is more powerful than Satan, the church would have been spared." Close quote. After the lost 10 tribes were translated in 570 AD, and for the next 1260 years of the Great Apostasy, Satan had power given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations, as described in Revelation 13:7. The 1260 years ended with the restoration of the priesthood and the right to legally administer the gospel in April 1830, as I discussed in my podcast on January 20th of 2026. The year 570 is the setting for Revelation 13:7, when it could be said that Satan had universal power in the entire world because the priesthood was no longer legally administered on the earth. However, Satan's war on the saints that led him to this pinnacle of power began 500 years earlier in 70 AD. By that early date, all Christ's apostles were dead except John, as I discussed in my very first podcast on September 30th of 2023. The apostolic era had come to an end because apostolic authority no longer governed the church. This was also the time of the Flavian Dynasty in the Roman Empire, which ruled from 68 to 96 AD. The 3 emperors in this dynasty included Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, who generally followed Nero's precedent of criminalizing and killing Christians, as described in the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, saying, "The Flavian period, 68 to 96 AD. In the Flavian period, no uniform imperial policy against Christianity can be discovered. According to Ramsay, the Flavians developed the practice set by Nero, from punishment of Christians for definite crimes to proscription of the name. But, as we have seen, the Neronian persecution settled the future attitude of the Roman state toward the new faith. The Flavians could not avoid following the precedent set by Nero." Close quote. J. Perry adds this additional insight about Satan's power in and through the Flavian dynasty, saying, "Nero had great power and allied himself with Satan to persecute the saints. He took his own life in AD 68, and in the year that followed, civil war threatened to destroy the very life of the empire. Vespasian rose to power in AD 69 and restored order, but during his reign, he proved to be as vicious against the Christians as Nero had been. Close quote. Domitian, the last of the Flavian emperors, made the persecution and death of Christians a matter of public policy throughout the Roman Empire, which are aptly called the second Christian persecution after Nero's first Christian persecution. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia states that it is Domitian who stands out prominently as the persecutor of this period as Nero of the first period. His procedure against Christians was not an isolated act, but part of a general policy under which others suffered. But for ordinary Roman citizens and for provincials, the profession of Christianity merited death. No definite edict or general prescription was enacted. Only the principle instituted by Nero was allowed to be carried out. Close quote. Alexander Morrison explains how persecution worked among both Jews and Christians under Domitian, saying, Domitian had ordered attacks on Jews, and his agents pursued this goal with relentless ferocity, attempting to establish who were Jews and who merely lived like Jews. Christians were at risk because many were former Jews. If Jewish converts to Christianity denied that they were Jews in order to escape the tax, they asserted their Christianity, which was even worse. Many were martyred, according to the reports. Close quote. The Antonine Dynasty of Roman emperors ruled from 96 to 192 AD. In general, this was a more tranquil time for Christians, as explained by the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, saying, the Antonine period, 96 to 192 AD. On the death of Domitian, peace was restored to the Christian church, which lasted throughout the brief reign of Nerva, 96 to 98, and the first 13 years of Trajan. It is a curious fact that some of the best of the Roman emperors, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, Decius, and Diocletian, were harsh on the Christians, while some of the worst, as Commodus, Caracalla, Heliogabalus, left them in peace. Christianity had been rapidly spreading in the interval of tranquility. Pliny became governor of Bithynia in 111 AD. Some Christians were brought before him, and on established precedents were ordered to be executed for their religion. But being of a humane disposition, he shrank from carrying out the wholesale execution required by a consistent policy. Close quote. The Antonine Roman emperors, for the most part, were equitable in their character. They did not enact new laws against the Christians, and those enacted by Nero and Domitian had been repealed. This does not mean that Christians were free from persecution. Mobs were incited to violence against the Christians at the instigation of the pagan priests more than from the Roman emperors. The general tranquility of the Antonine dynasty was not altogether pleasant, however. Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, was martyred during this period, as were other notable Christian fathers. However, in the bigger picture, the improving conditions for Christians can be seen in the actions of the Emperor Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 AD. He upheld death as the penalty for professing Christians, but he also decreed that they should not be sought out, and he granted them a measure of due process, which means, 1, the police were not to seek out the Christians, but if they were accused and convicted, they were to be punished. 2, anonymous tips were not accepted. 3, those suspected of criminal Christianity could be pardoned on proving that they were not Christians or by renouncing Christianity. Now that's what I call due process. Right. In this time of general tranquility, Christianity spread rapidly, but in an apostate form. Few records describe what happened to Christians during the 2nd century. Some people refer to it as a blind spot in ecclesiastical history. However, there can be no doubt that by the middle of the 2nd century AD, Christianity had been largely Hellenized. That is, the Christians had largely adopted a Greek lifestyle into their Christian doctrines, as described by Matthias Cowley, saying, in speaking of the 2nd century of the Christian era, Mosheim says, "For the noble simplicity and the majestic dignity of the Christian religion were lost, or at least impaired, when these philosophers presumed to associate their dogmas with it and to bring faith and piety under the dominion of human reason." Close quote. The general calm of the 2nd century from 100 to 200 AD turned ugly, generally speaking, in the 3rd century from 200 to 300 AD, as explained by B.H. Roberts, who said, early in the 3rd century, a law was enacted by the Emperor Severus, making it criminal for any reason to abandon the religion of his fathers for that of the Christians or the Jews. The object of the law was to stay the propagation of Christianity, which was spreading abroad on every hand, and while it was not intended to increase the hardships of those already Christians, it nevertheless encouraged the governors and judges of some of the provinces, especially those of Egypt and other parts of Africa and Asia, to sorely afflict the saints. Many of the poor were put to death, thousands of them, if we may credit Eusebius, and many of the rich intimidated into paying large sums of money to the judges to secure them from torture and death. Still, this persecution was not long continued, nor was it general throughout the empire, and after it subsided, there was a long period of peace. Pity it is that we have to say that it was more hurtful to the church than the periods of the cruelest persecution. Close quote. In general, the worst periods of Christian persecution came in the reign of Severus from 193 to 211 AD, and in the reign of Maximum from 235 to 238, as well as the reign of Decius Trajan from 249 to 251. Decius Trajan exterminated large numbers of Christians during one of the most severe periods of Roman persecution, as described by B.H. Roberts, who said that under Decius Trajan, the governors of the provinces were ordered on pain of forfeiting their own lives either to exterminate all Christians utterly, or bring them back by pains and tortures to the religion of their fathers. Even Gibbon, whose constant effort is to belittle the sufferings of the early Christians, says of this persecution, the bishops of the most considerable cities were removed by exile or death. For more than 2 years the persecution raged with unmitigated fury, and great multitudes of Christians in all the Roman provinces were butchered in the most inhuman manner. This persecution, writes Dr. Mosheim, was more cruel and terrific than any which preceded it, and immense numbers dismayed, not so much by the fear of death as by the dread of the long-continued tortures by which the magistrates endeavored to overcome the constancy of the Christians, professed to renounce Christ, and procured for themselves safety either by sacrificing, in other words, offering incense before the idols, or by certificates purchased with money. Close quote. The edicts and decrees of Decius Trajan also forbade Christians from attending church services. Some of their meeting houses were destroyed and cemeteries were desecrated. Bishops and deacons were executed. Many Christians had their properties confiscated and they were banished. Despite these very harsh conditions, apostate Christianity continued to grow whenever and wherever persecutions generally subsided. Let me illustrate what I mean by apostate Christianity with this example given by James Talmage, who said, "Early in the 3rd century, the Bishop of Carthage decided that persons of weak health might be acceptably baptized by sprinkling, and with the license thus given, the true form of baptism gradually fell into disfavor, and unauthorized practices devised by man took its place." Close quote. History also tells us that creation ex nihilo, meaning something from nothing, had become a fundamental doctrine of Orthodox Christianity by the early 3rd century. This utterly false doctrine probably became a Christian doctrine in the apostate church through the writings of Theophilus of Antioch, also known as the Bishop or Pope of Antioch. As the church moved into the late 3rd century, the relative calm brought an attitude of indifference among Christians, as explained by B.H. Roberts, who said, "In consequence of the prominence that has been given to the persecutions of the Christians during the first 3 centuries, the impression very extensively prevails that the early Christian church was constantly under the hard pressure of continuous and relentless persecution. This, however, is not the case. There were many periods of peace granted to the Christians. Indeed, their periods of persecution were only occasional, and it is a question if these periods of peace were not more detrimental to Christianity than the seasons of persecution." Milner, under the authority of Origen, says that the long peace granted the church in the 3rd century during the reigns of several emperors from about 260 A.D. to the opening of the 4th century produced a great degree of lukewarmness and religious indecorum. Close quote. Alfred Milner, who lived from 1854 to 1925, wrote about the history of the Roman Empire. He described the scene of calm among the Christians in the last half of the 3rd century, saying that this did not prove favorable to the growth of grace and holiness. "In no period since the apostles was there ever so great a general decay as in this. Not even in particular instances can we discover during this interval much of lively Christianity." He adds that when threats were made against Christians, vast numbers lapsed into idolatry immediately. Even before men were accused as Christians, many ran to the forum and sacrificed to the gods as they were ordered, and the crowds of apostates were so great that the magistrates wished to delay numbers of them till the next day, but they were importuned by the wretched suppliants to be allowed to prove themselves heathens that very night. The 4th century brought renewed persecution of Christians that began when the Emperor Diocletian demanded that Christians give up their sacred books, and they were put to death if they refused. The first decade of the 4th century was called the Great Persecution. It appears that Diocletian envied the growing strength of the Christians, and he wanted to destroy this obstacle to his status as an absolute monarch. Diocletian issued 4 progressively severe edicts between 303 and 305 A.D. that were designed to stamp out Christianity once and for all. In these edicts, Christians were forbidden to assemble for worship, and all Christian churches destroyed. The clergy was imprisoned, and Christians were required to perform paganistic sacrifices or face death. B.H. Roberts provides a few additional details to these events, saying, "The royal palace at Nicomedia being twice set on fire, soon after the first edict of Diocletian was published, the crime was charged to the Christians and led to the issuance of a second edict, which caused many Christians to suffer the penalties inflicted on incendiaries, torture, and death. Following this came rebellion against Roman authority in Nicomedia and Syria. This too was charged to the intrigue of Christians and was made a pretext for throwing all bishops and ministers into prison. A third edict authorized the employment of torture to compel them to offer sacrifices to the gods of the heathen." Close quote. Milton Bachman described the effects of the Diocletian edicts, saying, "In some regions of the empire, the edicts were promptly followed with action. Nobles were reduced in rank, citizens became slaves, priests were tortured, churches were abolished, books were destroyed, and some Christian villages were left in ruins. The most severe persecutions occurred in the east, where Galerius, a chief instigator of the persecution, sought to enforce the decrees. He removed Christian officers from the army, ordered all his troops to offer sacrifices, and insisted on the enforcement of the intolerant Diocletian edicts. Christian tradition, however, has greatly exaggerated the impact of the great persecution, for persecution in the West ceased before it fully developed, and relatively few martyrs were sacrificed there." Close quote. The Diocletian edicts were the last deadly edicts of the Roman Empire against Christians. In this we can see the fulfillment of John's prophecy in Revelation 12:17 that Satan's bloody campaign against the remnant or seed of the woman of Christ's ancient church continued for more than 2 centuries after 70 AD. After these very harsh edicts, early in the 4th century, Satan and the first beast suddenly ceased to wage their physical wars against Christianity. It was almost as though Satan finally realized that the more he physically abused Christians through the Roman emperors, the more these faith-filled Roman subjects would dig in their heels even to follow an apostate form of Christianity. Some scholars suggest that the Diocletian edicts did have the effect of overcoming the saints entirely, as recorded by John in Revelation 13:7. This is suggested in the following quote by B.H. Roberts, who said, "With the exception of Gaul, or Western Europe," says Schlegel, "streams of Christian blood flowed in the provinces of the Roman Empire. Everywhere the Christian temples lay in ruins, and assemblies for worship were all suspended. The major part had forsaken the provinces and taken refuge among the barbarians. Such as were unable or unwilling to do this kept themselves concealed and were afraid for their lives if they appeared in public. The ministers of Christ were either slain or mutilated and sent to the mines or banished from the country. The avaricious magistrates had seized upon nearly all their church property and their private possessions. Many, through dread of undergoing torture, had made away with their own lives, and many apostatized from the faith, and what remained of the Christian community consisted of weak, poor, and timorous persons. Truly, it would appear from this that the beast, unto whom was given power to make war with the saints and to overcome them, had at last triumphed." Close quote. Now, I'm not prepared to say that the Diocletian edicts fulfilled John's prophecy in Revelation 13:7, and that the saints were then overcome. The Christians were certainly brought down to a new low, but they were not out, as evidenced by the events in Christian history that followed the Diocletian edicts. Within 2 decades, the Christian religion became the state religion of Rome. For Satan had overcome the Christians within the meaning of Revelation 13:7. He had to overcome them both physically and spiritually. And so it was that less than a decade after the deadly Diocletian edicts, Satan made war against Christianity from within by adopting rather than destroying apostate Christianity, as explained by Milton Bachman, saying, "Diocletian's feeble answer to the problem of the growth of Christianity had been the attempted destruction of the church by the state. Discreetly, Constantine met the challenge of Christianity by forming an alliance with this thriving movement, which then represented approximately 10% of the population of the empire. The new religion won a significant victory, but again, not without concessions. An unhealthy secular influence proceeded from the state to the church, which inevitably led to the union of these two powerful institutions. Close quote. James Talmage spoke of this unholy union of church and state, saying, Constantine made the so-called Christianity of the time the religion of his realm, and zealous devotion to the church became the surest recommendation to imperial favor. Whatever vestiges of genuine Christianity may have possibly survived in the church before were buried beyond the sight of man by the abuses that followed the elevation of the church organization to secular favor through the decree of Constantine. The emperor, even though unbaptized, made himself the head of the church, and priestly office was more sought after than military rank or state preferment. The spirit of apostasy by which the church had become permeated before Constantine threw about it the mantle of imperial protection and emblazoned it with the insignia of state, now was roused to increased activity as the leaven of Satan's own culture flourished under the conditions most favorable for such fungoid growth. Close quote. The incredible transition from killing to coddling Christians is nothing short of miraculous, and you can see the invisible hand of God in the events that brought this about. The transitional process began when Diocletian abdicated the throne suddenly in 305 AD after issuing his 4 edicts against the Christians. The Emperor Galerius succeeded him in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and then, on his deathbed from a loathsome disease in 311 AD, Galerius issued an edict of toleration in favor of the Christians, and he actually sought their prayers for himself and the empire. Meanwhile, Constantine the Great became the emperor in the western part of the empire in 306 AD, and in 313 he issued the Edict of Milan. This edict paved the way for apostate Christianity to become the state religion for the entire Roman Empire, as explained by Alexander Morrison, saying, "The Edict of Milan, issued by Constantine and Licinius the next year, AD 313, gave unrestricted freedom to the Christians and provided for complete restoration of all church property still remaining in the hands of the state or of individuals after the persecutions of the previous decade. Though it did not establish the church, the edict signaled the end of persecution." Close quote. You might ask, if Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire early in the 4th century, what did it replace? This question is answered by Milton R. Hunter, who said, "During the early Christian period, Mithraism became the most popular religion in the entire Roman Empire. In fact, it became the state religion. It retained that position of importance until 312 AD, when Constantine legalized Christianity, and then in 392 AD, it received its death blow when Theodosius outlawed all pagan religions. If it had not been for these important events, and especially for the sheer superiority of Christianity, much of the world might be worshiping Mithra today instead of Jesus. So powerful did this pagan cult become." Close quote. So who was this Mithras that was worshipped by the pagans? He was an ancient Iranian deity that was honored as a god of loyalty. He was regarded as a god of agreements and moral order that reflected the values of justice and friendship. In short, he was a pagan god whose moral order was kicked to the side of the road by Constantinian Christianity. Constantine's adoption of Christianity may seem surprising since he was a devout pagan. Historians are generally inclined to believe that Constantine chose the rather resilient religion of the Christians to be the state religion out of political expediency and to cement the many religious factions of his divided realm under one common interest. According to one popular legend, Constantine was miraculously persuaded to promote the cause of Christianity when he saw a burning cross in the sky with the Greek inscription that said, "By this sign thou shalt conquer." Other historians say that an Egyptian priest promised Constantine the absolution for the murders he committed if he accepted Christianity. In a fit of jealousy, Constantine had put to death his son, Crispus, his wife, Fausta, and his brother-in-law, Licinius. The legend of the cross in heaven is received with a high degree of skepticism among historians as the converting cause of Constantine, which B.H. Roberts describes, saying, "Constantine and his army are said to have seen near midday in the heavens a luminous cross bearing the inscription in Greek, 'By this conquer.' The same night, Christ appeared to him in a dream, accompanied with the same sign, and instructed him to make a standard bearing the cross as a protection against his enemies." The circumstance is related at great length in the life of Constantine by Eusebius, on whose sole authority the story rests. It is regarded as suspicious that he makes no reference to the matter in ecclesiastical history, written only 12 years after the event. The story is altogether rejected by some writers as the cunning invention of interested priests seeking to make the cross an object of veneration, and even Christian writers of high standing, among them Mosheim, consider the story to be doubtful. Close quote. Easton's Bible Dictionary cites Eusebius as the sole source of the legend and states that Constantine pretended at a critical moment that he saw a flaming cross in heaven, and adds that Constantine also claimed that the following night Christ also appeared to him and ordered him to take for his standard the sign of the cross. Yeah, I don't think so. But it does explain why the cross, or labarum, became the standard of the Roman army, and under this banner Constantine prevailed in his 18-year civil war against rival emperors until he became the sole emperor of the entire Roman Empire in about 323 AD. As sole emperor, Constantine reversed all prior anti-Christian edicts throughout the empire and thereafter adopted the Catholic, meaning universal religion that was already apostate. James Talmage said, "The church was saturated with the spirit of apostasy long before Constantine took it under his powerful protection by according it official standing in the state." B.H. Roberts said, "The reign of Constantine marks the period when the paganization of Christianity had become complete, rather than the start of it. Long before Constantine, Christianity had already adopted pagan doctrines and pagan practices that appealed to parishioners with a pagan mindset, as explained by J. Reuben Clark, who said, "The conversion of Constantine brought many pagans into the church who were quite ignorant of Christian principles, who were still clinging to their heathen notions, and who were spiritually crippled from deprivation of heathen morality. The churchmen zealously and blindly sought to win these pagans by elaborate ceremonies and splendid edifices that would rival the paganism they had outwardly repudiated but still inwardly believed, in the hope that pagans would become true believers. The result could have been easily anticipated because perfectly natural. True, the new converts on the one hand took on some of the Christian belief, but in equal truth, the Christians on the other hand were infected with the doctrines and practices of heathendom. Pagan usages were brought into the church as the burning of lamps and candles in the day, the burning of incense, lustrations, or a method of purification, which earlier Christians had ridiculed in the pagans. Close quote. Even as paganism existed within Constantine's adopted church, paganism outside the church was subsequently outlawed by Emperor Theodosius in 383 AD, as explained by Milton Bachman, saying, Theodosius in 383 became sole and absolute emperor of the Roman Empire. Theodosius's name is associated with two great triumphs, the triumph of Christianity and of the Nicene faith, whereas Constantine established toleration, granting Christianity a legal status. Theodosius declared that Christianity was to be the only legal religion in the empire. He ordered the pagans to discontinue offering sacrifices or burning incense. He forbade them to worship in their pagan temples. He closed many pagan houses of worship and destroyed others. Some of the temples were seized by the government and given to the Christians, thus conforming them into Christian meeting houses. Although heathen worship persisted, Theodosius was able to reduce paganism to a state from which it never emerged. The Christian persecution of the pagans was far more effective than had been the pagan persecution of the Christians. Close quote. Bachman describes the conversion of pagan temples to places of Christian worship. A notable example of this is the Pantheon in Rome. You can see the Pantheon, which means many gods, in the video log that I published on my YouTube channel on January 23 of 2026. So check that out when you can spare 3.5 minutes. It's an amazing structure built by the Romans in about 129 AD as a pagan temple and converted to a Christian church in 609 AD when the Emperor Phocas gave the building to Pope Boniface IV. This is also an illustration of how the Roman Church became extremely wealthy. In other words, after Christianity was taken under the wing of Constantine, the church became rich and worldly in the extreme, as explained further by B.H. Roberts, saying, Constantine became the patron of the Christian religion and elevated the sect from the condition of a persecuted society to the state religion of the great empire. He invited the Christian ministers to his court, gave them a seat at his table in the palace, loaded them with honors and riches, but was careful himself to draw the line of ecclesiastical policy and pattern the church organization very much after the constitution of the civil government of Rome. As a reward for these favors, the ministry of the church stood in humble attitude at the foot of the throne. They overlooked the shortcomings of their great patron, guilty of putting to death without just cause a wife, a son, and in violation of his plighted faith, his brother-in-law. Close quote. John describes the worldly form of the Constantinian church in Revelation 17, 3-4, as a woman on a scarlet-colored beast arrayed in purple and scarlet, which I will discuss in due course. Citizens in the Roman Empire were forced to accept Constantine's apostate form of Christianity at the tip of his sword. Thus, apostate Christianity that was once persecuted took up the sword and became the persecutors, as described by B.H. Roberts, saying, during the 4th century, by following the policy of suppression inaugurated by this first Christian emperor, Christianity was changed from a persecuted to a persecuting religion. Without restraint from the ecclesiastical authorities, the Christian emperors issued edicts against the pagan religion, prescribed its followers, destroyed its temples, and confiscated its property to the uses of the rival religion. Even Neander, speaking of this revolution and constrained as he is to say all that he can for the honor of the Christian church, is compelled to admit that the relations of things had become reversed. Close quote. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia states that as soon as Christianity had gained tolerance, it immediately became intolerant. This continued for centuries, and it is evident in the Christian crusades against so-called infidels throughout Europe and in the Holy Land in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. Pope Urban II called for the Crusades to wrest the Holy Land from the dominion of the Islamic infidels, and Europe responded that God wills it. These warring Christians from the time of Constantine had no likeness whatsoever to saints in the ancient Church of Jesus Christ. There were no saints in the Constantinian Church in the traditional sense of that word. Since there were no saints anywhere in the world by 570 A.D., John correctly foresaw in Revelation 13:7 that Satan had power given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. To say that there were no saints does not mean that Christian worship was wholly lacking. However, there was no true worship anywhere in the world, least of all in the Roman Empire, where the apostate Christian religion became completely paganized after Constantine made it the state religion of Rome for political reasons, as explained by Alexander Morrison, who called Constantine the consummate politician, saying, Constantine was, in 312 A.D., at the time a pagan who had grown up in the court of Diocletian, the major author of the Great Persecution. Throughout his reign, Constantine, a consummate politician, continued to play to both pagan and Christian sensibilities. In his exhortations, he used vague monotheistic language that both pagans and Christians could embrace. He was careful not to antagonize the army, which remained largely non-Christian. He restored pagan temples as he built Christian churches. He continued to pay public homage to the sun, Sol Invictus. In dedicating his new capital, Constantinople, he used both pagan and Christian rites. Close quote. Joseph Fielding Smith also talked about how Constantine played both sides of the fence, so to speak, when he said, Constantine continually showed by his acts that he felt he must be the impartial sovereign of all his people, not merely the representative of a successful faction. Hence, if he built Christian churches, he also restored pagan temples. If he listened to the clergy, he also consulted the haruspices. If he summoned the Council of Nicaea, he also honored the Statute of Fortune. If he accepted the rite of baptism, he also struck a medal bearing his title of God. Close quote. Even though Constantine was not a member of the Christian Church throughout much of his life, as emperor, his imperial influence over the Church meant that he dominated the ecclesiastical offices who bowed to his decrees. He was personally involved in the doctrinal debates among Christians at the Council of Nicaea in 326 A.D., from which there arose a sort of pseudo-Christianity as the state religion in a decaying empire. It's reported that Constantine submitted himself to Christian baptism near the end of his life. According to several ancient historians, including Lactantius and Eusebius, Constantine postponed his baptism until the last year of his life so he could be free of sin going into the afterlife. It was actually quite customary in the 4th century for professing Christians to put off baptism as long as they dared, so that just before death, as if by magic, they obtained forgiveness. The Cyclopedia of Biblical, Theological, and Ecclesiastical Literature describes the end of Constantine's life, saying, though he professed Christianity, he was not baptized till he fell sick in 337, in which year he died in Nicomedia. The Senate of Rome placed him among the gods, and the Christians of the East reckoned him among the saints. His festival is still celebrated by the Greek, Coptic, and Russian churches on the 21st of May. Close quote. So that concludes my podcast about the history of the Christian church during the period of the Great Apostasy, which John describes in Revelation 13:7 as the time when Satan made war on the saints and completely overcame them. My next podcast will cover Revelation 13:8, where all that dwell on the earth worship Satan as a further evidence of the Great Apostasy. So until then, thanks for watching, listening, sharing, and subscribing, and to Jenna and Kristen for all their technological help. I'll see you next time on Unveiling Jesus Christ.